You are the beautiful community. Got sent a piece in the Wall Street Journal. That's a major interview of Steve Kotkin. And the last section of that interview has proven to be controversial, it seems. So we're going to read it together. It seems like Steve Kotkin is recommending some kind of pressure on Russia that others have found unpersuasive, including Mark Galeotti on Twitter X, reacting to this piece as though it were wishful thinking. Let's try to figure this out for ourselves. As you know, we're admirers of Steve Kotkin very much on the channels. So let's rock and roll and read together. Mr. Kotkin is critical of Mr. Biden's Ukraine policy, though in a more measured way than Mr. Trump is. He says Mr. Biden deserves credit for supporting Ukraine's self-defense and also for working closely with US allies and partners. But overall, the Biden strategy failed. Why? Because the argument was that we are supporting Ukraine to put them in the best position to negotiate a more favorable settlement. But the problem was there were never any negotiations. The support, Mr. Kotkin laments, was endless and pointless. There was no pathway for negotiations. I would put this by saying that there was no strategy. That there was an idea about supporting Ukraine without going out of our way to do so for another 6 months and another 6 months and seeing what happens. And I explained that strategic incapacity by saying that it's a causal product of democratic incapacity at home. So it's not just that there is a question about whether the West supported Ukraine enough. It's that there is an even more important question that the West was never coherent enough as an actor to frame for itself and for others what its aims actually were. Enter the 47th president. He comes in, he forces the issue, immediate negotiations. Mr. Kotkin sums up Mr. Trump's strategy as follows. We're not going to wait till Ukraine is, quote, in a better position for negotiations. We're just going to impose an imperative that we have negotiations starting now. This compelled Mr. Zelensky and the Ukrainians to become more realistic about their war aims. Now, I don't think Mr. Trump has quite said, let's have negotiations now in a realistic way, because I don't think Mr. Trump is capable of negotiations. So there is a kind of a cartoonish sense in which that's true, but it's not three-dimensionally true. It's not true that the Trump administration has seriously veered the war toward negotiations, because that would require Trump understanding what the issues are and having basic competencies he doesn't have. The flaw in Mr. Trump's approach is that he didn't put the same pressure on the other party, Mr. Kotkin says. He put all the pressure on the Ukrainians and so far next to no pressure on Putin and the Russian establishment to force negotiations. The result? We're kind of stuck. Even though Trump was correct to move away from the Biden strategy, he's failed in part to execute a negotiation strategy where he's built leverage with the Russian side. The bottom line, Mr. Kotkin says, is that there's been insufficient pressure on Mr. Putin. There's been military pressure on a high level, thanks to the Ukrainians' courage and ingenuity, but not on a scale that's working. Russia has a bigger army and support from China and North Korea, which helps quite a bit. Mr. Putin is also willing to sacrifice Russian lives. Bleed and bleed and bleed, sending boys to their death on the battlefield in ways that most democratic countries, including the flawed democracies such as Ukraine, cannot do. That leaves Ukraine in a war of attrition where it counts lives and the other side doesn't. Now, there is much talk about how, having reached 1 million casualties, this is building up to be unsustainable for the Putin regime. And that's a mistake, both at the level of their capacity to gather up citizens for the war, and at the level of the politicization in society, which is not sufficient to wake up to these casualties, largely because folks going to the war on contract are seen as neoliberal entrepreneurs making deals with the state which might or might not work out for them. When bad things happen to these people, there is no politicizing consequence because these people are seen as engaging in some kind of neoliberal or hyper-neoliberal exchange with the state. So casualties do not politicize in Russia as things stand. Economic pressure has been severe, but oil revenues still flow to Mr. Putin, delivering a massive cash flow that floats the war. So unless you cut off all oil revenues, your economic pressure is going to be insufficient. Of course, we must note the remarkable amount of money that Europe has sent to Mr. Putin since the beginning of the war. Most important, the West needs very severe, and this is what people got concerned about in Kotkin's assessment. Most importantly, the West needs very severe political pressure on Putin's regime, and that comes in the form of alternatives to his rule. Many prominent Russians feel that Russia is on a self-defeating trajectory right now. They're nationalists, they're not Democrats, they're authoritarians. They don't look like the kind of Russian opposition we might associate with in terms of values. They have no sympathy for Ukraine, but they have a lot of sympathy for Russia. And they feel that an end to the war would help Russia regain the civilian economy that it's lost. US and European intelligence agencies are recruiting them inside. We know who they are. These sentiments, Mr. Kotkin says, are widespread in the Russian establishment. They're not. And even in the armed forces, they're not. And became visible with the public comments of retired Colonel General Leonid Ivashov, who in Feb 2022 accused Mr. Putin of engaging in a criminal policy of provoking war and urged him to resign. Obviously, sitting officers of the armed forces and security services cannot voice such public sentiments, Mr. Kotkin says. The vast increase during the war in cases brought for alleged treason indirectly testifies to the existence of the sentiments and the regime's knowledge and fear of them. Well, let's go on before we sort of raise our eyebrows further. Mr. Kotkin believes Mr. Trump should make an offer to these patriotic Russians in exchange for retrenchment, defined as an end to the aggression against Ukraine and a turn to focusing on developing Russia, its people and economy for the future. If Mr. Putin refuses a deal, maybe Mr. Trump can appeal to others inside Russia who would be willing to do it or urge Putin to do it. Maybe the start of a political bank run or fear of it could destabilize the regime enough to force retrenchment. It's a long shot, but military and economic pressure without political pressure has not worked. There are other things Mr. Trump could do. These include, let's just read through till the very end, we're almost there, and then react. These include removal of Russia's Gazprom Bank from the SWIFT international banking system, to which it still has 10 years access, greenlighting the confiscation of $300 billion worth of Russian deposits in European banks, getting India to buckle and stop buying Russian oil, and most audacious, cutting a deal with Xi behind Putin's back to reduce China's support for Russia in a bargain between the US and China. It's thinkable. Well, it's just about thinkable. All of the threats Mr. Putin faces, Mr. Kotkin says again, of all the threats Putin faces, none is bigger than President Trump. Putin may smirk, he may walk down the red carpet in a strut, he may joke for the camera with Mr. Trump, but ultimately Trump holds the cards. And if the president uses those cards, he could unsettle Putin's smirk, his self-confidence, and his maximalist demands. Will this happen? I don't know. But it's there for the taking. So this has been declared as wishful thinking by some commentators. Now, I've only now just read it. So do I think it's wishful thinking? I think that we can say something more generous to this than just dismiss it as wishful thinking. After all, Steve Kotkin says, look, it's a long shot. The reason I said no and no and no and no when Steve Kotkin talks about these sort of moods of opposition within Russian institutions and within the regime is not just because the way Kotkin presents it here is an exaggeration of the reality, but because there's a sociological misunderstanding in the way Kotkin talks about this. And the sociological misunderstanding, it's not some kind of major error he makes, it's just that I'm pointing out that it would be helpful to put things in terms of this sociological insight. And that's that events occur first, then people develop an oppositional mood within the regime and within institutions. It doesn't work the other way around. It's not that there are all of these people sitting there waiting for us to engage with them who are opposed to Putin. They're not sitting there opposed to Putin. Rather, if certain events occurred, and we saw some of this during the Prigozhin mutiny, they could become opposed to Putin. Right? In regimes like this, you do not have steady, subdued opposition. You have a kind of precautionary neutrality, a kind of evasion, until it can resolve into opposition when circumstances allow. So Kotkin is wrong to imply that this opposition is just sort of shimmering behind the scenes. But he is right insofar as it is true that that opposition would materialize as soon as the political oxygen for it, develops, would develop. So he's half right, half wrong in the framing here. The framing shouldn't be they're all there sitting quietly opposed to Putin. No, they're all there without a position, and their position will develop once avenues for political action develop. So political action avenues come first, right? Position comes second. It's the opposite of what Kotkin implies. Next. I think that there is a kind of normative impeccability to what Steve Kotkin is basically proposing here. It's just that we don't have a platform to deliver it. You see, if the West were in a position to approach Russia's invasion of Ukraine strategically, then political pressure on the Putin regime by addressing Putin's alternatives within the country is exactly what would be the right thing to do. But for us to tell ourselves that we should do it requires a greater capacity for coherent action on the international stage than we have, secondary to democratic decline at home. And so Steve Kotkin is inviting us to make a certain kind of use of our broken bicycle that would be a perfectly decent use if we had a sort of a semi-functional moped or a fairly functional moped, but we don't. We have a semi-broken bicycle. And so the question arises, at what point does it stop being aspirational and become sort of silly for us to talk about the possibilities with our bicycle as though they were the possibilities we would have with a moped? And the reality is we do not have enough of a moped to think about the kind of political pressure that Steve Kotkin is recommending there. But it is the kind of political pressure that under sort of normatively impeccable conditions, I agree in recommending too. But I think we need to, first of all, make an assessment of Western capacity and then secondly move on to recommending or not recommending that kind of pressure. And at the moment there is a very big gap between the two. So Steve Kotkin is aspirationally addressing us as though we have a capacity we don't just lack, but that we're progressively losing more and more with each half a year that passes, because we're in decline. But I don't think it's wrong to put on the table the kind of aspirations we would have if we were stronger, if we were more democratically regenerated than we are. And so I'm not comfortable to say this is just wishful thinking, but I am comfortable to say that this is presented from a certain kind of hypothetically optimistic hill of possibilities that outruns the possibilities we currently have. And then it becomes to an extent a matter of sensibility for an important public intellectual like Steve Kotkin to decide whether he wants to say this or not. I was part of the way to saying this in the opening stages of the war, but with the big qualification that it's very understandable why it's probably not in our reach because of democratic decline. I've recently stopped saying it because the gap is just too much, right? I'm asking the West to hit 50 miles an hour on a semi-broken bike when they don't have a moped. And then the final takeaway, I would say here, is that I do think that there's something bizarre about the way Steve Kotkin is addressing Trump. He's addressing Trump as a kind of failed, pathetic, disorganized, lamentable version of a politician who aspirationally can be pushed toward being some kind of a Reaganite figure. But the point is that he can't. The point is that he is on Putin's side in substance. The point is that he is narcissistically married to Putin, is dependent on the glow Putin irradiates because he needs to bathe in it. He is also an ideological ally of Putin's, subscribing to a kind of monarchism that says that might is right, that's doing the rounds around the globe. So that's what I would say is wrong with this end section of Kotkin's major interview. But at the same time, I'm more sort of respectful of Kotkin's seriousness to say that this is just wishful thinking. I do think what he's advancing as far as the strategy of putting political pressure on Russia is better than wishful thinking, but it is a kind of a message from another world in which the West has greater strategic capacity. We could aspire to it, and the best response in Kotkin's favor is, well, look, if we get 5% closer to being in that position, that's in of itself an improvement. So that's my 2 cents. Lots of love.